1,733 people lost their jobs the day Redbox died. The bright red movie rental kiosks that once stood outside almost every drugstore and grocery store in America shut off overnight. The workers were fired with no severance and no final paycheck for work they had already done. And when some of them went to fill a prescription or see a doctor, they found out their health insurance had been canceled, even though the premiums were still being deducted from their paychecks. The money had been taken out. It had simply never been sent to the insurer. A federal bankruptcy judge looked at that and said, quote, "I find it sickening. Tonight, the story of how Redbox, a brand almost every American once used, was bought by a company that loaded it with debt, drained it through a structure that paid its own chairman 10% of every dollar that came in, and then collapsed so completely that 24,000 kiosks were left abandoned where they stood, bolted into the concrete for Walgreens and Walmart to rip out at their own expense. A company doesn't usually die like this. Most bankruptcies are slow. This was a looting. So tonight, the question this channel always asks, when Redbox collapsed, who actually got rich and who got the bill? The answer is 1,000 workers who never got their last paycheck and a chairman whose family business walked away intact. To understand what happened, you have to understand that Redbox was already dying when somebody decided to buy it, and that somebody knew it. Redbox was born in 2002, of all places, inside McDonald's. It started as an experiment in automated convenience, a vending machine for DVDs. Within a few years, it was spun out, picked up by a company called Coinstar, the people behind those coin-counting machines in supermarkets. By 2013, Redbox was everywhere. More than 43,000 kiosks across the country. At its peak, roughly half of every physical disc rented in the United States went through one of those red boxes. $1 or $2 a night, returned the next day. It was simple, it was cheap, and for about a decade, it printed money. If you are old enough, you remember it. The red glow at the front of the store. Standing there in the cold, scrolling through the touchscreen while your ice cream melted in the bag, trying to decide between two movies because the second one was technically free if you returned the first by 9 the next night. For a whole generation, Redbox was just part of the texture of American life, as ordinary as the soda machine or the lottery terminal. That is exactly why its ending is so jarring. This was not some obscure company. It was a fixture, and it was gutted from the inside while no one was really watching. And the man who would end up running it had already taken one company into bankruptcy before, and then streaming happened. Netflix, then Hulu, then Disney, then everyone. Why drive to a drugstore and rent a disc when the movie was already sitting on your television? The numbers tell the whole story. In 2019, Redbox brought in about $858 million in revenue. In 2020, that fell to $546 million in revenue. In 2020, that fell to $546 million. By 2021, it was down to $288 million. Losses were doubling. The kiosks were emptying out. Anyone looking at this business could see exactly where it was headed. In September 2016, the private equity firm Apollo Global Management had bought Redbox's parent company for about $1.6 billion and run it for several years. In 2021, Apollo took Redbox public through a SPAC, a blank check shell company, rolling its ownership into publicly traded stock rather than cashing out. So when the next buyer arrived, Apollo was writing the stock down, not walking away with a bag of cash. That next buyer was a small company with an unusual name, Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment. Yes, the same brand as the inspirational books. Its CEO and chairman was a man named William Rouhana, and in August 2022, his company bought Redbox in an all-stock deal valued at around $375 million while taking on hundreds of millions of dollars in Redbox's existing debt. On paper, there was a story. Combine Redbox's kiosks with streaming, build a free ad-supported video service, and turn a dying DVD company into a digital one. It was the kind of pitch that sounds reasonable in a boardroom. The problem was the math. The combined company would have needed to nearly double its revenue to make the debt work. Instead, revenue kept falling. Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment had strapped itself to an anchor and jumped into the water. But here is where this stopped being a simple story about streaming killing DVDs. Because while the company was sinking, money was flowing out through a structure its chairman had built to guarantee it would, regardless of whether the company ever turned a profit. Here is the structure, and it is the heart of this story. According to the short-selling research firm Hindenburg Research, which published a detailed warning about the company before it collapsed, William Rouhana controlled about 96.8% of the company's voting shares. He didn't just run it, he controlled it almost completely. And the company was set up so that entities Rouhana controlled were paid roughly 10% of its gross revenue, not 10% of profit, 10% of every dollar that came in the door, through license and management fees that flowed upward to the parent Chicken Soup for the Soul brand, the one he and his wife own. Think about what that means. It means the company could lose hundreds of millions of dollars, and the people at the top would still get paid, because their cut came off the top line, before profit, before payroll, before the lights. It was a structure that rewarded extraction regardless of whether the business survived, and this was not hidden. Hindenburg laid it out publicly. They also pointed out something else. This was not Rouhana's first company to go bankrupt. Years earlier, he had run a telecommunications company called Windstar, which collapsed after the dot-com crash. The warning signs were on the table for anyone willing to read them. So watch what happened as the company died. In 2023, Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment lost $636 million. $636 million in a single year. And in that same year, entities controlled by William Rouhana took $18.4 million out of the company in fees. The lenders later went further. In bankruptcy court, the investment firm HPS, which had lent the company hundreds of millions, alleged that Rouhana had been paid roughly $27 million in management fees since the acquisition, and said there was a credible basis to hold him personally liable. The company was hemorrhaging money, and the fees kept flowing. By early 2024, the end was visibly close. The company was carrying more than $560 million in debt. It had entered forbearance with its lenders, which is the corporate equivalent of begging the bank not to foreclose yet. In the first quarter of 2024, it lost another $53 million, and entities Rouhana controlled pulled out roughly $9 million more in fees and dividends. And then came the part the judge would call sickening. Starting in the middle of May 2024, the company kept deducting health insurance premiums from its employees' paychecks. But it stopped sending that money to the insurer, Anthem. The workers had no idea. The deductions showed up on their pay stubs exactly as before. But the coverage had been quietly canceled. People went to the pharmacy, went to the doctor, and discovered they had no insurance while they were still paying for it. On June 11, 2024, Rouhana dissolved the company's entire board of directors except for himself. There was now no one left to stop him. Days later, Payroll was missed entirely. On June 24th, he stepped down as chief executive. And on June 28, 2024, Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It listed $970 million in debt against just $414 million in assets, and only $4.9 million in assets, and only $4.9 million in cash. The company that once handled half the disc rentals in America had less money in the bank than a single well-run restaurant. Chapter 11 is supposed to be a reorganization, a chance to restructure and survive. This company didn't get that chance. On July 10th and 11th, the bankruptcy judge, Thomas Horan, converted the case to Chapter 7. That means liquidation, the end. Everything sold for parts. And it was in those hearings that the judge, learning that health premiums had been taken from workers and never paid to the insurer, delivered the line, "I find it sickening." Now look at the full receipt. Who got the bill? First, the workers. 1,033 employees were terminated, most of them the day the case converted to liquidation. No severance. They were collectively owed about $3.5 million in back wages, $2.2 million in health benefits, and nearly $600,000 in retirement contributions, money taken from their checks that may never be fully recovered. Second, the studios that supplied the movies. Universal was owed $16.7 million. Sony, $9.1 million. The BBC, another $9 million. The BBC, another $9 million. In a liquidation, unsecured creditors like these are last in line, and there was almost nothing left. Third, the retailers. Those 24,000 kiosks didn't disappear. They were 900-pound machines bolted into concrete outside Walgreens, Walmart, Kroger, and thousands of other stores, and they were now dead weight. Walgreens alone reported spending $184,000 a month just on the electricity to power kiosks that no longer worked, and had to go to court for permission to remove them at its own cost. And fourth, the customers. Roughly 40 million people had used Redbox over the years, and their data, rental histories, email addresses, partial payment information was left sitting on the hard drives of abandoned kiosks, with no plan to erase any of it. Security researchers later pulled years-old rental records straight out of machines left in parking lots. There was no plan for the kiosks, no plan for the data, no plan for anything. The company that built a network spanning tens of thousands of locations had no money left to even turn it off properly. Some of the machines were eventually hauled away. Others were sold off as oddities, $100 collector pieces of a company that used to be everywhere. So who got rich? The fees that entities Rouhana controlled collected on the way down, the $18.4 million in a single losing year. His son's two consulting companies, which had been paid $95,000 and $100,000. And the brand itself, Chicken Soup for the Soul, the publishing business that Rouhana and his wife own, was a legally separate company. It survived the bankruptcy untouched. The week the entertainment company collapsed, the publishing side said it was business as usual. The losses stayed with the company that died. The valuable name walked away clean. After the collapse, the Chapter 7 trustee filed suit against Rouhana, his wife, and the parent company, alleging mismanagement and what he called pillaging by insiders on a scale rarely seen with public companies. 11 former employees filed their own lawsuit using the word Ponzi scheme to describe the web of entities. Those are allegations, claims in court that still have to be proven, but the basic facts underneath them are not in dispute. A dying business was bought with borrowed money. 10% of its revenue was routed to the people at the top, regardless of profit. The fees kept flowing as the losses mounted, and when the money finally ran out, it was the workers, the ones who had their insurance taken from their own paychecks, who paid the price. Was this just incompetence? A bad bet on a dying industry? That is the kindest version. But incompetence doesn't explain why the fees kept flowing, while the company lost $636 million. It doesn't explain dissolving the board right before the collapse. A company that is genuinely trying to survive does not drain itself on the way down. Redbox didn't simply die. It was emptied out and then left in the parking lot.